I knew I'd already won the moment the inspector said, "There's nothing in your yard that violates HOA rules." The low hum of diesel engines still echoed under my feet as I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching Linda Harper's smile slowly crack in the late afternoon sun. She was standing exactly where my illegal structure used to be, staring at a perfectly flat patch of grass, freshly seeded, nothing out of place, nothing she could point to, nothing she could control, and what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 2,200 square feet of reinforced concrete, steel, wiring, and airflow systems sat hidden just 12 feet below her designer heels, built completely within the law she had tried so hard to weaponize against me. The whole thing started 3 weeks earlier with the sharp chemical smell of spray paint hitting raw wood, that bright red violation notice slapped across my shed door like a warning shot, the word illegal dripping down the panels in letters big enough for the entire cul-de-sac to read. I remember the sound of gravel crunching under Linda's tires as she pulled away that morning, not even bothering to knock, just leaving the notice like she owned the place, like she owned me. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've spent the last 15 years designing infrastructure systems that keep cities running: storm drains, retention basins, structural foundations, quiet work, precise work, the kind where one overlooked detail can cost millions, or worse. That shed she flagged wasn't some eyesore. It was 12 by 16 feet of solid framing, something I built with my own hands the summer after my dad passed. A place where every tool had a story and every inch smelled like sawdust and motor oil. But to Linda, it was just a violation, just another checkbox in her endless crusade to keep the neighborhood perfect. She ran the HOA like a private kingdom, always smiling, always polite, but every word out of her mouth carried the weight of someone who thought rules were meant to bend others, not herself. The notice gave me 72 hours to remove the structure or face daily fines, escalating penalties, legal action if necessary, all written in that clean, confident font that tried to make it sound reasonable. I stood there that morning, fingertips brushing over the drying paint, the sharp tang burning in my nose, and for a second, I actually considered tearing it down, playing along, keeping the peace. But then I noticed something small, buried in the wording of the violation code printed at the bottom of the page. I went inside, pulled up the HOA bylaws, the same documents most people skim once and forget, and started reading, line by line, like I was back on a job site reviewing blueprints. Outside, the neighborhood carried on like nothing had happened, sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm, distant lawn mowers humming, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through the air. But inside my head, something had shifted. Linda thought she had me boxed in, thought she could force compliance with a piece of paper and a few fines. But what she didn't understand, what she never bothered to check, was that rules only work when you know where they end. And that morning, staring at those pages, I found the edge. I kept rereading that same paragraph until the words stopped looking like words and started looking like openings. The kind you only notice when you have spent years around systems built by people who assume nobody will ever question them. The air inside my house felt still, thick with that faint smell of fresh paint drifting in through the window from the shed outside. And somewhere down the street a leaf blower kicked on, that constant suburban background noise that makes everything feel controlled, predictable, like nothing is supposed to break the pattern. But the more I read, the more I realized Linda was not enforcing rules, she was relying on them being misunderstood. Section 8.3 covered detached auxiliary structures, clearly defined, above ground, visible, subject to aesthetic guidelines, height restrictions, setback distances, every inch accounted for, but nowhere in those pages. Not a single line addressed subsurface construction, nothing about what existed below grade. Nothing about structures that did not alter the visual landscape, and that absence was not an accident, it was a blind spot. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock, and felt that familiar shift in my chest, the same one I used to get when a design problem finally made sense, when all the pieces clicked into place, and the solution was not just possible, it was inevitable. Outside, the sun was dropping low, casting long shadows across the yard, and I could see the red violation mark glowing against the wood like it was daring me to react, to fight her on her terms, to argue about permits and appearances and community standards. But that was exactly what she wanted. Linda did not win because she was right. She won because everyone else played inside the line she drew. I walked back out to the shed, ran my hand along the rough grain of the wood, feeling the heat it had absorbed all day. And for a moment, I let myself remember why I built it: the quiet weekends, the smell of cut lumber, the steady rhythm of a project that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. And then I looked past it, at the ground beneath my feet, at the slight slope toward the back fence, at the way the soil had always drained after a storm, details most people would never notice. But to me they read like a blueprint already drawn. I did not need to save the shed. I needed to replace it with something that could not be touched. That night I cleared off my workbench inside, the hum of my desk lamp cutting through the silence as I pulled out graph paper, not because I needed it, but because it helped me think, helped me see the structure before it existed, 12 feet down to stay below frost line concerns, reinforced concrete walls thick enough to meet storm shelter standards, ventilation routed through discrete outlets disguised as irrigation covers, electrical tied into the main panel but coded as emergency backup infrastructure. Everything labeled, everything documented, everything legal. The faint smell of pencil shavings mixed with the lingering scent of motor oil as lines turned into dimensions and dimensions turned into something real, something bigger than anything Linda could imagine when she dropped that notice on my door. I checked county regulations. Next, not HOA rules, actual jurisdictional authority. And there it was, plain as day: storm shelters and emergency bunkers permitted with proper engineering approval. No requirement for above-ground visibility, no aesthetic review, no HOA oversight beyond what could be seen. And that was the moment I knew this was not just a workaround. It was a reversal. She had tried to control what I built by limiting what was allowed on the surface, but she never considered what could exist underneath it. And by the time she realized, it would already be finished, inspected, and protected by the same system she thought she controlled. I filed the permit request the next morning before the sun had fully burned off the dew, the air still cool and carrying that faint earthy smell that always settles over the yard at dawn. And for the first time since the notice showed up, I felt calm, not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer reacting, I was moving. The county office sat 20 minutes away, a plain brick building with fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead, the kind of place where everything moved slow unless you knew exactly what you were doing, and I did. I slid the application across the counter, stamped drawings, structural calculations, soil reports, everything lined up clean and professional, labeled as a residential storm shelter, emergency use only, fully compliant with state and federal guidelines. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Just another file in a stack of projects that passed through every week. The clerk barely looked twice, just nodded, stamped it, and told me it would go to review. And that was it. No questions about aesthetics, no HOA involvement. Because at that level, they did not matter. The drive back home felt different. The road stretching out ahead of me like a timeline I had already seen the end of, gravel popping under my tires as I pulled into the driveway where that red mark still clung to the shed like a warning that had already expired. By mid-afternoon, Linda made her next move. Because of course she did, her white SUV. Rolling up slow, tires crunching just loud enough to announce her presence. Before she even stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a badge of authority, I could smell her perfume before she spoke, something sharp and artificial that cut through the scent of cut grass. And she gave me that same tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Cole, I hope you have made progress on removing that structure," she said, her voice smooth but edged with expectation, like she had already decided how this conversation would go. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence hang just long enough to make her uncomfortable before I answered. "I am handling it." And technically, that was the truth. Her pen tapped against the clipboard, a soft, impatient rhythm, and she glanced past me at the shed, at the mark, at the yard, scanning for signs of compliance, for evidence that her system was working. "You understand the fines begin tomorrow," she added, almost casually, like she was reminding me about a scheduled appointment. I nodded once. Slow, controlled, the same way I used to when a contractor thought they could rush a timeline without understanding the scope. And I could see the flicker of irritation cross her face when she realized I was not arguing, not pleading, not pushing back the way everyone else did. What she did not understand was that arguing keeps you inside the system, and I had already stepped outside it. That evening, the first email from the county came through. Confirmation of submission, review pending, a small thing, but it felt like a switch being flipped. I printed it out, laid it on the workbench, and stared at it for a moment, listening to the quiet tick of cooling metal from the tools I had been using earlier, the shed still standing behind me, still marked, still illegal in her world, but already obsolete in mine. By nightfall, I had made the first calls, scheduled equipment, quiet rentals. Nothing that would draw attention, just standard excavation gear booked under a weekend project. Classification, and when I stepped back outside, the neighborhood had settled into that familiar stillness, porch lights glowing, distant televisions flickering behind curtains, everything calm on the surface. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the ground where the real work was about to begin, feeling the cool night air settle around me. And for the first time since this started, I was not thinking about the shed at all. I was thinking about depth, about layers, about everything that existed where nobody bothered to look. The first night the machines arrived, I kept every light in the house off, standing by the window with just enough of a view to see the edge of the yard without drawing attention. And when the low rumble of the excavator finally rolled in just after midnight, it felt less like construction and more like something unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. The diesel engine idled deep and steady, that heavy mechanical hum vibrating through the ground before a single shovel touched dirt. And the operator, a guy I had worked with years ago on a municipal drainage project, stepped out, nodded once, no questions asked, because he knew better than to waste time talking when everything had already been planned down to the inch. The air carried that sharp mix of fuel and damp soil as the first scoop cut into the ground behind the shed, slow, controlled, every movement deliberate, not a rush job, not a loud demolition, just careful excavation, the kind that left the surface looking almost untouched if you did not know where to look. I had already mapped the exact footprint, marked the boundaries with temporary stakes that would be gone before sunrise, every measurement checked twice, setbacks respected, depth calculated to stay within structural tolerance and code compliance. Because this was not about hiding something illegal, it was about building something they could not regulate. The sound of metal teeth scraping through packed earth echoed softly into the night, not loud enough to wake anyone who was not already listening. And I remember thinking how different it felt compared to the noise of that leaf blower a few days earlier, that constant surface-level irritation Linda thrived on, because this noise had purpose, direction, weight. By 2 a.m, the outline of the excavation had taken shape, a clean rectangular cut that dropped deeper with every pass, the walls sharp, the floor leveling out as we hit the planned depth, 12 feet down, just where I needed it, and the cool air rising from the pit carried that unmistakable underground scent, dense, mineral, untouched by everything happening above. I climbed down once, boots sinking slightly into the loose soil, running my hand along the wall, feeling the texture, checking compaction, already visualizing where the forms would go, where the reinforcement would sit, where the airflow channels would be routed, and for a moment, standing there beneath the surface, everything above felt distant, smaller, like the rules that governed it did not quite reach this far. We worked through the night without rushing, rotating tasks, checking alignment, keeping everything precise, because speed was not the priority, invisibility was, and by the time the first hint of light started to creep over the horizon, the excavation was complete, covered, secured, nothing visible from the street but a yard that looked slightly disturbed if you were paying attention, and nobody in that neighborhood ever paid attention to anything below eye level. I stood there as the machines pulled out, the engine noise fading into the distance, replaced by the soft morning sounds of sprinklers clicking on and birds starting up like nothing had happened. And I could already picture Linda stepping out later, clipboard in hand, scanning for compliance, looking at the shed, the grass, the fence line, never once thinking to look down, never once considering that while she was enforcing rules about what could exist on the surface, I had already started building something far beyond her reach, something that would not just replace what she tried to take, but redefine what control actually looked like. The concrete trucks came 2 nights later, right on schedule, their engines idling low as they backed into position with a precision that felt almost surgical, and the moment the first chute swung into place, The smell hit me. Sharp, wet cement mixing with the cool night air, heavy and permanent. The kind of scent that tells you something is about to exist for a long time. I stood at the edge of the excavation, watching the gray mixture pour down into the forms we had set the day before, steel reinforcement already locked in place. Every bar tied, every spacing measured, nothing left to chance, because once it's set, there would be no corrections, no adjustments, just structure. The crew moved in rhythm, no wasted motion, smoothing, leveling, checking alignment with quiet efficiency, and beneath the surface, the shape of the space began to take form, not just a hole anymore, but walls, foundation, something defined, something intentional. Above ground, everything still looked ordinary, the shed still standing with that fading red mark, the lawn trimmed, the fence straight, the kind of visual calm that made people assume nothing had changed, and that was exactly the point. By mid-morning, the neighborhood started to wake up, garage doors opening, cars pulling out, the usual routine, and right on cue, Linda appeared again, her SUV rolling slowly past before stopping just short of my driveway, her window lowering just enough for her voice to carry across the distance. "Mr. Cole, I will be issuing the first fine today," she called out, tone measured, almost satisfied, like she had been waiting for this moment. I walked out, hands clean, expression neutral, the faint scent of concrete still clinging to my clothes, and nodded once, not offering anything more than that. And I could see the confusion flicker across her face again, that same brief hesitation when reality did not match her expectation. She stepped out this time, heels clicking against the pavement as she approached, clipboard ready, eyes scanning the shed, the yard, the visible world she believed she controlled, and for a second, she paused, noticing the slight disturbance in the soil near the back, the way the grass had not fully settled yet, and her gaze lingered there just a moment too long. "Have you been doing construction without approval?" she asked, her voice tightening slightly. The first crack in that polished confidence. I almost smiled, but did not, just shook my head slowly and said, "Everything I am doing is permitted," and that word landed heavier than anything else I could have said, because it shifted the ground under her, not physically, but legally, and she knew it. Her pen tapped once against the clipboard, sharper now, more deliberate, and she glanced back toward the street, as if looking for something to reinforce her position. But there was nothing there, no violation she could point to, no structure she could measure, just a yard that looked exactly the way it was supposed to. She handed me the notice anyway, paper crisp, the fine officially documented, and as I took it, I could feel the faint texture of the ink under my fingers, that same manufactured authority she relied on, but it felt different now, smaller, like something that had already lost its weight. By the time she walked back to her vehicle, the concrete below us was already beginning to set, slowly locking into place, forming walls that would outlast every piece of paper she could issue. And as her SUV pulled away, the sound of tires on pavement fading into the background, I looked down at the ground beneath my feet and realized the shift was complete. She was still fighting to control what she could see, and I was building something she could not even reach. By the end of that week, the structure below ground had moved past the point of being an idea and into something solid, something real, and every step deeper into the build made the world above feel thinner, less relevant, like it was operating on a different layer entirely. The framing for the interior went in next, pressure-treated supports anchored directly into the cured concrete. The sound of drills echoing in that enclosed space with a sharp metallic bite that carried up through the soil. Just enough for me to feel it in my boots, a low vibration that reminded me exactly how much was taking shape beneath a yard that still looked perfectly ordinary. The air down there had changed too, cooler, heavier, carrying that mix of fresh concrete, cut wood, and insulation, a scent that clung to your clothes long after you climbed back up, and every time I stepped out into the sunlight, it felt like stepping between two completely different realities. During the day, I kept everything quiet. No obvious movement, no signs of activity, just routine, just normal, letting the neighborhood settle into its patterns, because attention was the one thing I could not afford. But Linda did not let up, not even for a day. The notices kept coming, one after another, each one more formal than the last, each one carrying a little more weight in tone if not in actual authority, and every time I opened one, I could smell that same clean, sterile paper, feel that same rigid texture between my fingers, and it almost felt predictable, like she was following a script she did not know how to change. She started escalating, mentioning legal review, hinting at enforcement actions, even dropping off a printed copy of the community guidelines like I had somehow missed them, like the answer was hidden in plain sight if I would just comply. But that was the thing. I had read them more carefully than she ever had. One afternoon, she caught me outside again, this time without the smile, just a tight line across her face, her voice sharper than before. You are ignoring official notices. That is going to create bigger problems for you. And I could hear the shift in her tone, the control slipping just slightly, replaced by something closer to frustration. I leaned against the fence, the wood warm from the sun, and answered evenly. I am not ignoring anything. I am following the rules. And the silence that followed stretched just long enough for her to realize she did not have an immediate response, because from where she stood, everything still looked exactly the same. That night, the next phase went in, electrical conduit running along the interior walls, clean lines, properly spaced, everything labeled to code, the faint smell of heated plastic and insulation mixing with the cool underground air as connections were sealed, and I worked methodically, the way I always had, not rushing, not improvising, just executing a plan that had already been solved. Ventilation came next. Low-profile intake and exhaust routed upward through narrow channels that surfaced as nothing more than discrete ground covers, the kind you would never notice unless you were specifically looking for them. And even then, they blended into the yard like they had always been there. Each completed section added another layer of separation between what was visible and what was real, and I could feel the balance shifting more every day. Above ground, the shed still stood, still marked, still the focus of every notice Linda sent, but it had already stopped matching. It was just a decoy now, something she could point at while everything that actually mattered took shape beneath her feet. By the time I sealed the last conduit and stepped back, wiping the dust from my hands, I realized something had changed in me too. I was no longer reacting to her actions at all. I was building toward a moment she could not see coming, and the deeper I went, the more certain I became that when it finally surfaced, it would not just end the argument, it would end her ability to control it entirely. The final phase did not start with noise. It started with silence, the kind that settles in right before everything changes. And I remember standing at the edge of the yard just after sunset, the sky dimming into that deep blue where details blur and shapes flatten. And for the first time since this began, the shed no longer felt like something I needed to defend. It felt like something I needed to remove. The wood creaked softly as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of sawdust and oil lingering in the air, and I ran my hand across the workbench one last time, feeling the worn surface under my fingers, not out of hesitation, but out of closure, because this part of the story had already ended. It just had not been cleared from the surface yet. The demolition was quiet, controlled, nothing dramatic, just methodical disassembly, panels coming down piece by piece, screws backing out with a steady metallic click, each section carried away and loaded without leaving debris, scattered across the yard, because the goal was never to create a scene, it was to erase one. By midnight, the structure that had started all of this was gone, reduced to clean stacks of material ready to be repurposed or hauled off, and in its place was a smooth, leveled patch of soil that looked like it had always been there, like nothing had ever stood on it at all. I worked through the night restoring the surface, laying fresh topsoil, reseeding, watering just enough to settle everything in place, and by the time the first light touched the edges of the houses around me, the yard looked untouched, almost too perfect, the kind of uniformity Linda had been demanding from the start. But beneath that surface, 12 feet down, the final components were coming together. The access point installed flush with the ground, reinforced and sealed, its outline so precise it disappeared into the pattern of the lawn, the kind of detail only someone trained to look for it would ever notice. I tested the mechanism once, the low hydraulic hiss barely audible as the entry opened smoothly, revealing the finished interior below, clean lines, solid walls, lighting systems humming softly, air moving exactly as designed, everything complete, everything compliant. And then I closed it again, the surface returning to its seamless state. hiding everything in plain sight. Later that morning, right on schedule, Linda arrived again, clipboard ready, posture confident, expecting to finally see compliance enforced on her terms, and I could see it in her expression the moment she stepped out. That brief flicker of satisfaction as her eyes scanned the yard and found the shed gone. The violation removed, the surface corrected exactly as she had demanded. She walked the perimeter slowly, heels pressing into the freshly settled ground, her gaze moving across the lawn, the fence line, the empty space where the shed used to stand, and for a second, she allowed herself to relax, to believe she had won. "It looks like you finally handled the issue," she said, her voice returning to that smooth, controlled tone, the one she used when she thought the system had worked. I nodded once, calm, steady, and replied, "I handled it." And again, it was the truth, just not the version she understood. She marked something on her clipboard, satisfied, already shifting her attention to the next problem, the next rule to enforce, completely unaware that the real structure had already been finished, inspected, and protected by the very regulations she relied on. And as she turned to leave, the faint sound of her steps fading across the pavement, I stood there looking at the yard, at the perfect surface she believed she controlled, knowing that everything important was already in place, hidden just below it, waiting for the moment she would finally realize that control only works when you understand the full scope of what you were trying to control, and she never did. The email from the county came through 3 days later while I was standing in the kitchen, the faint smell of fresh coffee still hanging in the air, and the moment I saw the subject line, I already knew what it was, because everything had lined up too cleanly for it to go any other way. I opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, the same way I review any final document before signing off on a project. And there it was, approved, inspected, compliant with all applicable codes and regulations, the kind of language that does not leave room for interpretation, just facts, just authority that exists above anything the HOA could claim. I printed it out and laid it flat on the counter, the paper still warm from the printer, and for a moment I just listened to the quiet hum of the house, the distant sound of a lawn mower starting somewhere down the street, everything normal, everything unchanged on the surface. That afternoon, I made a call, not urgent, not aggressive, just procedural, scheduling a final inspection walkthrough, the kind that puts everything on record, documented, verified. And once that was set, I knew the timeline was locked in. Linda showed up again the next morning, earlier than usual, like she had something to prove, her steps faster, sharper against the pavement, clipboard already in hand before she even reached the yard, and I could see it in her eyes this time. Not confidence, not satisfaction, but curiosity, because something about the situation was not resolving the way she expected it to. "I have been reviewing your file," she said, skipping the usual greeting, her voice carrying that tight edge again. "And there are discrepancies." And I almost laughed at that word, because it told me exactly where her head was, still searching for something visible to challenge, still assuming the answer had to be on the surface. I stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the yard, clean, level, exactly within the standard she enforced, and said, "You are welcome to take a look." And she did, walking the space again, slower this time, scanning every inch, her heels pressing into the grass, leaving faint impressions that would disappear by the evening, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to find what was missing, or maybe what was hidden. She paused near the center, right above where the main structure sat 12 feet below, and for a second, just a second, I thought she might feel it, not physically, but intuitively, that something was there she could not define, and her gaze lingered, her posture tightening, like she was trying to connect something that refused to present itself. "You said everything was permitted," she pressed, and I nodded, reaching back inside to grab the document, the paper crisp, official, carrying more weight than anything she had handed me. And when I placed it in her hand, I could see the shift immediately, the way her fingers tightened slightly, the way her eyes moved faster across the page, searching for an angle, a clause, something she could use. But there was nothing there for her, just approval, just compliance, just confirmation that whatever had been built met standards she did not control. The air between us felt different then, heavier, quieter, like the balance had finally tipped in a way she could not reverse. And when she looked back up at me, the confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. This does not change the fact that structures must follow HOA guidelines, she said. But even as she spoke, it sounded weaker, like she was repeating something that no longer applied. I held her gaze for a moment, steady, calm, and replied, "It follows all applicable guidelines." And I let that word hang. There, applicable, because that was the difference. Not all rules apply everywhere, and she had never learned that. She handed the paper back without another word, her movements sharper now, more controlled, like she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. And as she walked back to her vehicle, the sound of her steps fading into the quiet afternoon, I knew the reveal was not about showing her what I had built. It was about making her realize she had already lost control of it without ever seeing it at all. The final inspection happened on a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where the air feels still and every sound carries just a little farther than usual. And I could hear the county truck before I saw it, tires rolling slow over the asphalt, gravel popping lightly as it turned into the driveway. Official but unremarkable, just another routine visit on paper. The inspector stepped out with a tablet in hand, calm, focused, not interested in appearances, only in compliance, and that difference mattered more than anything Linda had ever tried to enforce. He introduced himself briefly, walked the yard with measured steps, eyes scanning not for what looked right, but for what matched documentation, and when he reached the center of the lawn, he paused, glancing down at the subtle marker I had embedded, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and I could see the recognition in his expression, not surprise, just confirmation. I stepped forward, keyed in the access, and the low hydraulic release sounded beneath us, soft, controlled, the kind of sound that does not demand attention but commands it anyway. And as the ground section lifted cleanly, revealing the entrance below, the cool air rising from inside carried that familiar mix of concrete, filtered airflow, and sealed space, a controlled environment hidden in plain sight. The inspector nodded once, satisfied before even stepping down, because everything he needed to see was already there: precision, structure, intent. And as he descended, checking measurements, reviewing systems, verifying codes, I stayed above, listening to the faint echo of his movements below, knowing that every detail would align exactly the way it was designed to. When he came back up, he signed off without hesitation, tapping his approval into the tablet with a quiet certainty that carried more authority than any stack of HOA notices ever could. And just like that, it was official, documented, untouchable. Linda arrived halfway through that moment, her SUV stopping abruptly, door opening faster than usual, her steps quick, almost urgent, and the look on her face changed the second she saw the open entry, the ground no longer flat, the hidden space exposed not as a violation, but as something far beyond her reach. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes moving between the inspector, the opening, and me, trying to process something that did not fit within the rules she understood, and for the first time, she did not speak immediately. The inspector greeted her politely, explained in simple terms that everything present met county and state regulations, that the structure was classified appropriately, that it fell outside HOA aesthetic jurisdiction because it did not exist as a visible surface feature. And each sentence landed with quiet finality, removing piece after piece of the authority she thought she had. Linda's grip on her clipboard tightened, her posture rigid, but there was nothing left for her to enforce, nothing she could cite, nothing she could control, and I could see it in the way her eyes shifted, not searching anymore, just realizing. I closed the entrance smoothly, the mechanism sealing it flush with the lawn once again, the surface returning to that same perfect, compliant appearance she had demanded from the start. And in that moment, everything came full circle. The yard looked exactly the way she wanted, but it no longer belonged to her system of control. She turned without another word, her steps slower now, quieter, the sharp edge gone from her movements as she walked back to her vehicle. And when the sound of her engine faded down the street, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but completely different underneath. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet, knowing exactly what existed below it, not hidden out of fear, but placed there with intention, protected by the same structure she tried to use against me. And I realized something simple, something she never understood, control only. Works when it sees everything. And sometimes the smartest move is not to fight the rules. It is to build somewhere they cannot reach.